For 65,000 years, Aboriginal Australians lived on, managed, and shaped a continent roughly the size of the contiguous United States. At the time Britain arrived in 1788, there were somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million people living across that continent, speaking more than 250 distinct languages. In the century that followed, that population would collapse by as much as 90%. Not through neglect. Through policy, violence, and the systematic dismantling of everything that had made those civilizations possible. Britain did not stumble into Australia. It chose it, planned it, and executed one of the most deliberate colonial takeovers in modern history. A project that began as a solution to prison overcrowding and ended as the foundation of a nation of 27 million people. The wool industry that clothed Victorian England was built on land taken without treaty. The gold rushes that transformed the continent were fought over ground that had belonged to someone else for longer than recorded European history. And the wars that Australia fought in Britain's name, Gallipoli, the Somme, the fall of Singapore, would eventually give Australians the confidence to ask a question Britain had never intended them to ask. Why are we still doing this for you? In this documentary, we'll trace the full arc of that story, from the first footsteps on the continent to the slow, unfinished reckoning with what those footsteps cost. Long before the word Australia existed in any language, long before any European cartographer had dreamed of a great southern continent, people were already here. They had been here for so long that the very shape of the land had changed around them. At least 65,000 years ago, during a period when sea levels were dramatically lower and the continent formed part of a larger landmass scholars call Sahul, the ancestors of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples made one of the most extraordinary journeys in human prehistory. They crossed open water, navigated by stars and instinct, and set foot on a continent that would become their home for a span of time almost impossible to comprehend. To put it in perspective, their civilization was already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were built. It was already old when Rome rose and fell. What they built across those millennia was not primitive. It was profound. Over generations stretching back further than any written record, these first Australians developed more than 250 distinct language groups, each with its own grammar, its own poetry, its own way of describing the world. Kinship systems of extraordinary complexity governed marriage, land rights, and social obligations across entire regions. A person's identity, their responsibilities, their very place in the cosmos were encoded in these systems from the moment of birth. Nothing in European feudalism or Roman law came close to the sophistication of these ancient arrangements. The land itself was not simply occupied. It was managed, shaped, and sung into being. Aboriginal peoples developed a practice now recognized by ecologists as fire stick farming, the deliberate, careful burning of country to encourage new growth, drive game, clear pathways, and maintain the mosaic of habitats that made the continent so extraordinarily biodiverse. When European settlers later marveled at the park-like appearance of certain landscapes, at the open grasslands and the gentle spacing of trees, they were looking at the product of thousands of years of skilled human stewardship. They simply did not know it. Holding all of this together were the dreaming traditions. Not a religion in any European sense, not a mythology to be shelved alongside Greek legends, but a living, breathing framework that connected the present to the moment of creation. Songlines, invisible pathways crisscrossing the continent, carried knowledge encoded in song, dance, and story. A person who knew the songs could navigate hundreds of miles of unfamiliar country, reading the landscape like a map. These oral histories were not mere folklore. They were libraries. They were legal documents. They were the accumulated science and philosophy of a civilization that had learned to carry its knowledge without paper. And these peoples were not isolated. Thriving trade networks carried shells, ochre, stone tools, and ceremonial goods across the continent along routes refined over thousands of years. Long before European sails appeared, Makassar traders from the island of Sulawesi in what is now Indonesia were making annual voyages to the northern coasts of Australia, harvesting sea cucumbers and exchanging goods with Aboriginal communities. These were not chance encounters. They were regularized, diplomatic, and commercially sophisticated relationships that left their mark in Aboriginal language, ceremony, and genetic record alike. By the time the first European vessels cautiously probed the continent's edges in the early 1600s, they were not approaching an empty wilderness. They were approaching the edge of one of the oldest, most complex, and most enduring human civilizations the world had ever produced. What would follow the contact between these two worlds, so utterly different in their assumptions about land, law, and belonging, would change everything. And it began, as so many turning points do, almost by accident. For centuries before a single British boot touched Australian soil, the southern continent existed primarily as a fantasy. European scholars and mapmakers had long insisted that a great landmass must balance the continents of the northern hemisphere. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, and they drew it on their maps with remarkable confidence for something nobody had actually seen. It was more philosophical argument than geographical fact. The first to shatter that abstraction with lived experience was a Dutchman named Willem Janszoon. In 1606, sailing the vessel Duifken, meaning Little Dove, out of the Dutch trading empire centered on Batavia in modern Indonesia, Janszoon rounded the western shore of Cape York Peninsula and became the first European known to have set foot on Australian soil. He was not looking for a new continent. He was looking for gold and trade opportunities. Finding neither, and losing several crew members in violent encounters with Aboriginal peoples along the coast, he turned back. The continent had made a poor first impression. 36 years later, the Dutch tried again. Abel Tasman, one of the most skilled navigators of his age, departed Batavia in 1642 and embarked on a sweeping voyage that would map significant portions of the Australian coastline without his ever realizing the true scale of what lay to his east. He charted the island that now bears his name, Tasmania, as well as parts of New Zealand, but the western and southern approaches he traced gave no hint of harbors, riches, or fertile land. The Dutch East India Company, a corporation of breathtaking commercial ruthlessness, drew a simple conclusion. If there was no profit, there was no point. The most vivid dismissal came from an Englishman, William Dampier, a former buccaneer turned explorer who visited the northwest coast in 1688 and returned in 1699 with official backing. His published accounts reached a wide European audience, and what he offered them was contempt. The land was barren. The people, he wrote with the casual cruelty of his era, were the miserablest people on earth. His reports did enormous damage. For a generation of European policymakers and investors, Dampier had confirmed what the Dutch suspected. Australia was not worth the effort. And so the continent was left alone. For over 150 years after Janszoon's landing, no European power attempted settlement. The Spanish were absorbed in their American empire. The Portuguese had their own concerns. The Dutch found greater profits elsewhere, and Britain, still consolidating its own colonial holdings across the Atlantic and in Asia, had not yet found a reason to look south. But reasons, as history repeatedly demonstrates, have a way of arriving. The man who would finally give Britain one was already being educated at a grammar school in Yorkshire, preparing for a life he could not yet imagine. By the spring of 1770, HMS Endeavour was a converted coal ship carrying the most consequential cargo Britain had ever sent into the Pacific. Lieutenant James Cook, a self-made man from a Yorkshire farming family, stood at its helm with a commission to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti, and once that task was done, to search for the great southern continent his predecessors had failed to confirm. He was meticulous, exacting, and possessed of a surveyor's eye for the world. He was also about to change it forever. Cook made landfall on the east coast of Australia in late April, dropping anchor in a wide, sheltered bay south of present-day Sydney. The air, by all accounts from the ship's journal, was thick with the fragrance of flowering plants. Joseph Banks, the expedition's wealthy young naturalist, was almost delirious with excitement. He and his team collected so many botanical specimens in those first days ashore that Cook eventually named the place Botany Bay. Banks would spend the rest of his life advocating for this coastline, insisting it was fertile, promising, and ripe for British settlement. But the bay was not empty when Endeavour anchored. The Gweagal people stood on the shore and watched. Cook recorded that 2 men armed with spears attempted to warn the strangers away. A musket was fired. 1 man was struck. The British stepped ashore anyway. It was, in miniature, a rehearsal for everything that would follow over the next 2 centuries. Cook spent the next 4 months sailing northward along the coast, mapping every headland, inlet, and river mouth with extraordinary precision. He named them as he went, that most confident of colonial acts, scattering English words across a landscape already carrying thousands of years of Aboriginal names. He nearly lost his ship on the Great Barrier Reef in June, the hull grinding onto coral in the dark, the crew frantic at the pumps for hours before the vessel was refloated. Even the reef, it seemed, resisted. On August the 22nd, 1770, Cook reached a small island at the northern tip of the continent. He called it Possession Island. There, with his officers assembled and the Union flag raised, he claimed the entire eastern coastline for King George III. He named it New South Wales. The ceremony took minutes. The consequences would take centuries to fully reckon with. What made Cook's claim remarkable and legally extraordinary was the doctrine underpinning it. British law required that land could only be claimed by conquest or by treaty unless it was deemed terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning nobody's land. Yet Cook had seen Aboriginal peoples at Botany Bay. He had sailed past their fires at night, smoke rising all along the coast. He had observed fish traps, canoes, and evidence of sophisticated habitation stretching thousands of miles. He knew the land was occupied. He claimed it anyway. The legal fiction of terra nullius declared that because Aboriginal Australians had no written law, no recognizable system of agriculture, and no permanent structures that European eyes could classify as ownership, they were not truly possessing the land in any form that mattered. They were, in the coldest terms of British imperial logic, invisible. The continent was, by decree, empty. It was a lie of almost incomprehensible scale. Between 300,000 and 1 million people lived across the continent. They spoke hundreds of distinct languages. They had managed their landscapes with fire for tens of thousands of years. Their connection to the land was not merely practical but spiritual and legal in its own right, encoded in story and ceremony that stretched back further than any European civilization could claim. But Cook's flag was planted, his maps were drawn, and his reports sailed back to London. Joseph Banks testified before a parliamentary committee, praising Botany Bay's potential. The machinery of empire began to turn. The question was no longer whether Britain would settle Australia. The question was when, and under what circumstances, that first wave of colonists would arrive on a shore that had never agreed to receive them. The answer to that question arrived not from ambition or grand imperial vision, but from a very particular and very pressing problem. Britain was running out of places to put its criminals. By the 1780s, the prisons of England were in a state of genuine crisis. Decades of rapid urbanization had pushed crime rates steadily upward, and the courts were sentencing men and women faster than the system could contain them. The solution that London had relied upon for generations, shipping convicted felons across the Atlantic to labor in the American colonies, had worked reasonably well for nearly a century. Some 50,000 convicts had made that crossing before 1776. Then the Americans declared independence, and that particular escape valve slammed shut. The consequences were immediate and grim. With nowhere to transport the overflow, authorities turned to a desperate improvisation. Old naval vessels, stripped of their masts and rotting at anchor in the Thames and at Portsmouth, were converted into floating prisons. These were the hulks, dark and fetid and infamous. Men slept chained below decks in conditions that bred disease and despair in roughly equal measure. By 1786, the hulks held more than 2,000 prisoners, and the number was climbing. Parliamentary committees fretted. Newspapers published outraged accounts. The stench, one inspector noted, was detectable from the riverbank. Something had to be done, and quickly. Several alternatives were proposed and discarded. West Africa was considered and rejected on account of the mortality rate, which even by the brutal standards of the era seemed unconscionable. Canada was debated. Various Caribbean islands were floated. None satisfied the competing demands of cost, distance, and practicality. Then, in August of 1786, the British government made its decision. There would be a penal colony at Botany Bay on the coast of New South Wales. The same harbor that Joseph Banks had praised before Parliament a decade earlier would receive Britain's unwanted. The man chosen to lead this extraordinary undertaking was Captain Arthur Phillip, a 50-year-old naval officer of quiet competence and considerable experience. Phillip had served in both the Royal Navy and, briefly, the Portuguese Navy. He was methodical, humane by the standards of his time, and possessed of a stubborn determination that the venture's critics were certain it would require. He accepted the commission in October of 1786 and immediately began the staggering logistical task of preparing a fleet to sail halfway around the world. The motivations behind the colony were never purely humanitarian or punitive. Strategic calculations ran alongside the prison crisis. Britain had noted with unease the growing French interest in the Pacific. timber from the forests of New South Wales and flax from Norfolk Island, the Admiralty reasoned could supply the Royal Navy with materials it currently sourced at great expense and inconvenience from the Baltic. The colony that began as a dumping ground might, with time, become something more useful. Through the spring and summer of 1787, 11 ships gathered at Portsmouth. There were 6 convict transports, 3 store ships, and 2 naval escorts. Aboard them were approximately 730 convicts, along with Marines to guard them, officers to govern them, and enough provisions, it was hoped, to sustain everyone for 2 years. Men and women, the young and the old, the hardened and the merely desperate, all were loaded into the holds of ships bound for the edge of the known world. On the 13th of May, 1787, the First Fleet weighed anchor and moved out into the English Channel. Britain had not sent these people to build a nation. It had sent them because it had no better idea. What they would actually build on that distant shore was a question nobody in London had yet thought carefully enough to ask. 8 months. That is how long the 11 ships of the First Fleet spent at sea before they glimpsed the coast of New South Wales. 8 months of rolling Atlantic swells, equatorial heat, and the grinding monotony of confinement. Arthur Phillip pushed his convoy hard, pausing at Tenerife, Rio de Janeiro, and the Cape of Good Hope to resupply, then driving south and east across the Indian Ocean. Remarkably, the fleet arrived largely intact. Of the roughly 730 convicts who had departed Portsmouth, fewer than 50 died at sea, a figure that reflected, however imperfectly, Philip's insistence on basic standards of hygiene and ventilation that many of his contemporaries would not have bothered with. On the 18th of January, 1788, the fleet entered Botany Bay. And immediately, something was wrong. Joseph Banks had praised this harbor before Parliament with the enthusiasm of a naturalist in rapture. What Philip found was something considerably less inviting. The bay was shallow and exposed, its soil thin and sandy, its fresh water inadequate for a settlement of any permanence. Within days of arrival, Philip had seen enough. He sent 2 longboats north to explore an inlet that James Cook had noted but never entered, a place Cook had named Port Jackson. What Philip's men found there would change everything. Port Jackson was, in Philip's own words, the finest harbor in the world. Deep sheltered, fed by freshwater streams, its northern and southern arms reaching far inland. On the 26th of January, 1788, Philip brought the fleet through the harbor heads and landed at a cove on the southern shore. He raised the British flag, the Marines fired a volley, and the officers drank a toast to the king. The convicts, standing at some distance from these ceremonies, observed without celebration. They were, after all, not guests of the empire. They were its burden. What no ceremony acknowledged was the presence of people who had lived on this land for more than 40,000 years. The Eora nation had watched these strange white-winged ships arrive with a mixture of curiosity and wariness that the colonists consistently misread. Initial encounters along the shoreline were tentative, occasionally friendly, more often tense. The Eora understood, with a clarity the British refused to match, that something irreversible had begun. Among the Eora, one figure would become central to the collision of these two worlds. Bennelong, a young man of intelligence and adaptability, was captured on Philip's orders in November of 1788 as part of a calculated effort to establish communication. What followed was stranger and more complicated than either captor or captive could have anticipated. Bennelong learned English with remarkable speed. He traveled to Britain in 1792, met King George III, and returned to a country that had been transformed in his absence. He lived the rest of his life between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. His story is not one of assimilation. It is one of rupture. Meanwhile, the colony itself was dying, or very nearly. The soil at Sydney Cove proved almost as hostile as Botany Bay. Crops failed. Livestock strayed. The supply ships from Britain arrived late, or not at all. By 1789, rations had been cut to near starvation levels. Convicts and Marines alike subsisted on the same meager portions. Disease moved through the settlement quietly and without mercy. And in that same year, smallpox tore through the Eora population with catastrophic efficiency, killing perhaps half of the Aboriginal people around Port Jackson in a matter of months. Whether this was accidental or deliberate remains one of the darkest questions in Australian history. The infant colony clung to existence with a stubbornness that surprised even those who had built it. Philip wrote home requesting more ships, more supplies, more people. Britain sent what it could, which was rarely enough and usually late. What had begun as a repository for the unwanted was becoming something else entirely, though no one yet had a name for what that something was. The question now was whether anyone would survive long enough for it to mean anything. The flag had been planted, the colony had survived its desperate infancy, and now Britain faced a practical question. What exactly do you do with 730 convicts and the thousands more arriving on every subsequent fleet when the prison you have built them is an entire continent? The answer, it turned out, was to put them to work. The convict system that evolved through the 1790s and into the following decades was less a formal institution than a machinery of improvisation, brutal in its logic and surprisingly efficient in its results. At its foundation sat the assignment system. Convicts were allocated, like livestock at auction, to free settlers and colonial officials who needed labor. A convict assigned to a farmer built fences, cleared land, and harvested crops. In return, the settler fed and clothed them. The Crown paid nothing. The convict had no say in the arrangement whatsoever. For those who obeyed, the system offered a narrow path forward. A ticket of leave granted conditional freedom within a district. A certificate of freedom followed the completion of a sentence. A pardon rare and precious could restore full rights. These were not gifts. They were incentives designed to extract compliance. For those who resisted, the consequences were deliberate and severe. The chain gang was the first descent. Men shackled together at the ankles broke roads through the Blue Mountains and hauled stone for government buildings under the watch of overseers who were not paid to be gentle. The lash was routine, administered with bureaucratic precision. 50 strokes for insolence. 100 for attempted escape. And for those who offended beyond the tolerance of the colony's courts, there were the secondary punishment sites. Norfolk Island, 1,000 kilometers into the Pacific, existed for one purpose only: to break men entirely. Commandants like John Price became synonymous with sadism. Prisoners on Norfolk Island built roads and quarried stone in conditions designed not to rehabilitate but to destroy. Port Arthur, established in Van Diemen's Land in 1830, pursued a different philosophy: the silence of solitary confinement, the psychological erosion of absolute isolation. Both places haunted the imaginations of every convict in New South Wales. The threat alone was enough to keep most men compliant. Women entered this system with even fewer protections. Female convicts were assigned to households as domestic servants, where their vulnerability to exploitation was considerable and their legal recourse almost non-existent. Those who could not be assigned or who misbehaved within their placements were sent to the female factories, institutions in Parramatta and later Hobart that served simultaneously as workhouses, prisons, nurseries, and places of punishment. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and raised children in conditions of enforced poverty while administrators debated whether they were criminal contaminations or salvageable souls. Yet within this machinery of coercion, human stories persisted with a tenacity that bureaucracy could never fully suppress. Francis Greenway, transported for forgery, designed some of the colony's most elegant buildings and earned his pardon from Governor Macquarie in 1819. Mary Wade, convicted in London at the age of 11, lived to become the ancestor of millions of modern Australians. Escaped convicts known as bushrangers terrorized the inland roads and became, in the colonial imagination, figures of defiant freedom. By the 1840s, the moral case against transportation was growing louder in Britain. Free settlers complained that convict labor degraded honest work. Reformers argued the system produced criminals rather than correcting them. The colony of New South Wales ended transportation in 1840, though Van Diemen's Land would absorb convicts for another decade still. The chains would eventually come off. But the society they had built, its roads, its courthouses, its hierarchies of shame and ambition, would endure long after the last convict ship had turned for home. While the convict machinery ground forward in the settled districts, something else was happening beyond the cleared farms and government roads. Something the official dispatches rarely named honestly. The land Britain was colonizing was not empty. It had never been empty. For at least 65,000 years, Aboriginal peoples had shaped this continent, burned its grasslands, mapped its waterways, and maintained through ceremony and custom one of the longest continuous cultures in human history. When the first fleet arrived, an estimated 300,000 to 1 million people lived across the continent, speaking perhaps 250 distinct languages. Within a generation, that world was being torn apart. The violence began almost immediately. By 1790, a man named Pumulwai of the Bijigal people had decided that accommodation was impossible. Operating from the bushland west of Sydney, he organized raids on farms, drove off livestock, and coordinated resistance with a tactical intelligence that genuinely alarmed colonial authorities. He survived a musket wound at close range in 1797, an event that led some of his people to believe him immune to British bullets. For 12 years, he remained uncaptured. Governor King finally offered a reward for his head, literally, and in 1802, colonists shot him and sent his preserved skull to a London scientific institution. He was the first of many Aboriginal resistance fighters the colony would find easier to destroy than to understand. As settlers pushed west toward the Hawkesbury and Nepean rivers through the 1790s, the conflict intensified into what historians now recognize as sustained frontier warfare. Aboriginal communities watched their food sources disappear as colonists fenced land and depleted the animals they hunted. Resistance was met with punitive expeditions, armed parties sent out with orders that everyone in the colony understood, even when the paperwork did not say so plainly. By 1824, the violence had reached the Bathurst Plains, where the Wiradjuri people fought back with coordinated ferocity against the dispossession of their country. Governor Brisbane responded by declaring martial law, the only time in Australian colonial history such a declaration was formally made against Aboriginal people. Soldiers and settlers killed Wiradjuri men, women, and children with legal impunity until the governor lifted martial law 4 months later, declaring peace. The Wiradjuri had not surrendered. They had simply been reduced beyond their ability to continue fighting. The massacres accumulated across decades and across the continent. In 1838, at a station on the Gwydir River in New South Wales, a group of stockmen rode into an encampment at Myall Creek and killed at least 28 Wiradjuri people, most of them women, children, and elderly men. What happened next was almost without precedent. 7 of the stockmen were tried, convicted, and hanged. The colonial establishment was outraged, not by the massacre, but by the prosecutions. Many settlers believed openly that killing Aboriginal people was not a crime worth punishing. The Myall Creek trials were a rare and fragile moment of legal accountability in a frontier history almost entirely defined by impunity. Disease moved faster than any soldier. Smallpox swept through Aboriginal communities before colonial settlement had even spread far, carried by trade routes inland from the coast. Influenza, measles, and tuberculosis followed. Some communities lost more than half their population within years of first contact. The survivors faced coordinated pressure on every front. Sacred sites were occupied or destroyed. Children were taken. People were herded onto missions and reserves, separated from the specific country to which their identity, their law, and their spiritual life were bound. The word used in official documents for all of this was settlement. The word used in London in parliamentary speeches and colonial prospectuses was civilisation. What it was, stripped of that language, was a systematic dispossession conducted with violence, disease, and the deliberate dismantling of everything that had given Aboriginal life its meaning and continuity. The frontier moved outward through the decades, and everywhere it moved, the same pattern repeated. By the 1860s, the wars were winding down in the south and east, though they would continue in Queensland and the north for decades yet. The colonists had taken the land. Now they had to decide what to build upon it. While the frontier burned at the edges of the colony, the settled districts around Sydney were consumed by a different kind of struggle. Not for land, but for power. And at the center of that struggle sat something as simple and as corrupting as a bottle of rum. The New South Wales Corps had arrived in 1790 to replace the Marines of the First Fleet. They were soldiers, technically, but in a colony without a functioning economy or reliable currency, they became something else entirely. Entrepreneurs. Monopolists. Men who understood that whoever controlled the supply of alcohol controlled everything else. Rum, along with spirits of any description, became the colony's de facto currency. The Corps officers bought the entire cargo of incoming trading ships, then resold the liquor at ruinous markups to a population of convicts and free settlers who had few other pleasures and fewer other ways to conduct basic transactions. Workers were paid in rum. Debts were settled in rum. land changed hands for rum. The officers grew wealthy in a place theoretically built on punishment and reformation, and they did so entirely at the expense of the people beneath them. 4 governors tried to break the core grip. 4 governors failed, frustrated, undermined, or simply exhausted. Then came William Bligh. Bligh arrived in 1806 carrying the considerable reputation of a man who had survived the mutiny on the Bounty. What that reputation should have warned London, perhaps, was that Bligh had a particular talent for provoking the men under his command to desperate measures. Within 2 years, he had done it again. On the 26th of January, 1808, the 20th anniversary of the First Fleet's landing, soldiers of the New South Wales Corps marched on Government House with fixed bayonets. It was the only successful armed military coup in Australian history, a distinction the country holds with some embarrassment. The ringleader was John MacArthur, a wool merchant and former Corps officer whose personal feud with Bligh had become indistinguishable from principle. For 2 years, a military junta governed New South Wales while London decided what to do. What London decided was to send Lachlan Macquarie. Macquarie arrived in 1810 with his own regiment, the 73rd, specifically to replace the Corps and ensure there would be no repeat performance. He succeeded. The Corps was recalled, and then Macquarie did something no one had quite expected. He decided to build something. In 11 years as governor, Macquarie transformed the physical and social landscape of the colony with a conviction that bordered on obsession. He commissioned roads, bridges, hospitals, and churches. He hired the convict architect Francis Greenway, a forger by trade and a genius by talent, to design public buildings that still stand in Sydney today. He named towns, mapped territory, and pushed settlement west across the Blue Mountains into the fertile plains beyond. More controversially, Macquarie extended genuine social recognition to emancipists, the men and women who had served their sentences and were legally free. He invited them to dinner. He appointed them to public office. The free settlers, those who had come voluntarily and considered themselves of an entirely different class, were appalled. The arguments over emancipist status would echo through colonial politics for decades. Macquarie was eventually recalled in 1821, worn down by the complaints of his enemies and a damning royal commission that found his spending excessive and his methods too independent. He died in London 3 years later, largely unrecognized. But the colony he left behind was unrecognizable compared to the one he had found. New South Wales was no longer simply a prison yard with agricultural ambitions. It was beginning, haltingly and imperfectly, to resemble a society. And that society was about to start asking questions that London had not prepared any answers for. While New South Wales was learning the difficult business of becoming a society, another British settlement was taking shape far to the south. And there, on an island the colonists called Van Diemen's Land, the encounter between the British and the people who had lived there for tens of thousands of years would reach a conclusion that haunts Australian history to this day. The first permanent British settlement on the island arrived in 1803, when Lieutenant David Collins led a small party to establish a base that would eventually become Hobart. The land was breathtaking, wooded, and mountainous, threaded with rivers teeming with fish. It was also home to the Palawa peoples, Aboriginal Tasmanians who had inhabited the island since the last ice age when it was still connected to the mainland. They numbered perhaps 5,000 at the time the British arrived. For the first 2 decades, the violence was sporadic. Settlers pushed inland with their sheep and cattle, fencing off the grasslands the Palawa had managed and moved through for generations. The competition for land produced friction, then raids, then reprisals. The pattern was familiar from the mainland, but in the compressed geography of an island, there was nowhere left to retreat. By the mid-1820s, the friction had become something worse. Governor George Arthur, who took charge in 1824, gave the conflict its darkest chapter. As Palawa resistance intensified, settlers responded with massacres. The Palawa responded with their own attacks on farms and shepherds. Arthur declared martial law in 1828, effectively authorizing soldiers to shoot Aboriginal people on sight in settled districts. Then came the Black Line. In the spring of 1830, Arthur mobilized something approaching 2,000 men, a human chain stretching across the Tasman Peninsula, intended to sweep the remaining Palawa into a corner of the island where they could be contained. It took 7 weeks, cost a substantial fortune, and captured exactly 2 people. The operation was, by any military measure, a failure. But it signaled clearly what the colonial government was prepared to do. What followed was, in its way, even more consequential. A missionary and self-appointed conciliator named George Augustus Robinson persuaded Arthur that removal was the answer. Between 1830 and 1834, Robinson traveled among the remaining Palawa groups, building relationships and making promises. He told them they would be safe, that they would have land of their own. On the strength of those promises, the surviving Palawa, perhaps 200 people, agreed to relocate to Flinders Island in Bass Strait. What they found there was not safety. It was a windswept settlement called Waibalena, where disease, despair, and cultural dislocation killed people at a devastating rate. By 1847, when the survivors were finally moved to Oyster Cove on the Tasmanian mainland, fewer than 50 remained. For over a century, the standard narrative declared that the Tasmanian Aboriginal people had simply ceased to exist. The last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal woman, Truganini, died in 1876, and her death was recorded as the extinction of an entire people. That narrative was wrong. Aboriginal Tasmanian people had survived through their descendants, through women who had maintained connection to country and culture across generations of dispossession. Today, a significant and vocal community of Palawa people assert their identity and fight for recognition, land rights, and the return of ancestral remains from museum collections around the world. What happened on Van Diemen's Land remains among the most contested and painful episodes in British imperial history. Whether it constitutes genocide by modern legal definitions is still debated. What is not debated is the scale of the destruction or the deliberate policies that drove it. As that destruction unfolded on the island, the mainland colony was beginning to transform in a different way entirely, flooded now not by convicts but by something far harder to control: free people with ambitions of their own. They came by the thousands, and then by the tens of thousands. Through the 1830s and 1840s, free immigrants poured into the Australian colonies, drawn by land grants, assisted passage schemes, and the simple promise of a new life beyond the reach of old hierarchies. Between 1830 and 1850, the free population of New South Wales alone grew from roughly 30,000 to over 100,000. These were farmers, tradespeople, servants, and younger sons of English and Scottish families who saw in Australia something they could never afford at home: land. And land in Australia meant one thing above all else. It meant sheep. By the 1840s, wool had become the colony's great engine. Merino flocks spread across the interior grasslands, and the phrase that would later define an era began to take shape in practice, if not yet in words. Australia rode on the sheep's back. British textile mills, hungry for raw material to feed the Industrial Revolution, could not get enough of it. Prices were strong, demand was insatiable, and any man willing to push beyond the settled districts could stake a claim on seemingly unlimited pasture. Those men were called squatters. The name began as a term of contempt, conjuring images of illegal occupation and rough living. But the reality was more complicated, and in time, far more powerful. Squatters drove their flocks beyond the officially surveyed boundaries of settlement onto crown land that belonged, in law, to no one, and in fact, to the Aboriginal peoples who had managed those grasslands for millennia. They built rough homesteads, hired convict and free labor, and ran pastoral operations of staggering scale. Some claimed runs the size of English counties. The colonial government watched this expansion with ambivalence. The squatters were breaking the rules, but they were also generating enormous wealth. By the 1840s, wool accounted for the vast majority of the colony's exports. You did not dismantle your most productive industry on a point of legal principle. In 1847, the British Crown resolved the tension, temporarily and in the squatters' favor. Orders in council issued from London granted squatters formal pastoral leases over the land they occupied, giving them legal security of tenure and, crucially, the right of preemption to purchase their runs if the land was ever opened for sale. With the stroke of the pen, the squatters became a landed class, their informal empires suddenly underwritten by the Crown itself. The tension this created would simmer for years. Small farmers, free immigrants who had crossed the world for a piece of ground, found the best land locked up behind the pastoral leases of men who had simply arrived first and claimed the most. The squattocracy, as critics called them, had become Australia's closest equivalent to the landed aristocracy of the Old World, building fortunes on country that was never truly theirs to take. That resentment would find its moment soon enough, as a very different kind of rush was about to reshape everything. In February of 1851, a man named Edward Hargraves knelt beside a creek near Bathurst in New South Wales and swirled a pan through the gravel. What came up would change Australia forever. Gold. Hargraves, who had recently returned from the California goldfields with a trained eye and a keen sense of geology, immediately grasped what he was looking at. Within weeks, the news had spread through Sydney like fire through dry grass. Within months, it had crossed oceans. But New South Wales had barely caught its breath before Victoria answered with something far greater. By July of that same year, gold had been found near Clunes. Then Ballarat. Then Bendigo. The Victorian strikes were not merely rich. They were staggering, among the most productive goldfields the world had ever seen. Nuggets the size of fists were pulled from creek beds. Men who had arrived with nothing left with small fortunes, and the stories of their luck drew more men still. The world descended on Australia with extraordinary speed. Ships crowded into Port Phillip Bay so thickly that their masts looked like a winter forest. Sailors abandoned their vessels the moment they dropped anchor and ran for the diggings. Merchants closed their shops. Farmhands walked off the land. From Ireland and Cornwall, from China's Guangdong province, from the goldfields of California and the hills of Chile, tens of thousands of people made the long passage south, drawn by the same ancient hunger for sudden wealth. The numbers were staggering. In 1850, the population of the Australian colonies stood at roughly 400,000. By 1860, it had grown to over 1 million. Victoria alone swelled from around 77,000 people to more than 500,000 in a single decade. It was one of the most rapid demographic explosions in colonial history. The goldfields that absorbed these masses were unlike anything Australia had produced before. Ballarat and Bendigo became chaotic, extraordinary cities of canvas and timber, alive with a dozen languages and the constant percussion of picks striking rock. Grog shops and brothels operated alongside reading rooms and debating societies. Men from incompatible cultures crowded together in conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. Tensions ran high, and they ran in familiar directions. Chinese miners, who by the mid-1850s numbered in the tens of thousands on the Victorian fields, faced sustained hostility from European diggers who resented their discipline, their numbers. Anti-Chinese riots at Buckland in 1857 and Lambing Flat in 1861 were violent and deliberate. The colonial governments responded not by protecting the Chinese, but by restricting their entry, planting the seeds of a racial exclusion policy that would endure for generations. For the colonies themselves, the transformation went far deeper than population figures. Gold reoriented the entire economy. The pastoral dominance of the squattocracy, so recently cemented by crown leases, suddenly faced competition for mineral wealth that required no land at all. Melbourne, virtually overnight, became one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Banks, merchants, and manufacturers rushed to meet the demands of hundreds of thousands of new consumers. The men who came for gold and stayed after it ran out needed something the old pastoral order had never provided: farms they could call their own. That demand, urgent and politically charged, was already building pressure beneath the surface of colonial life. The diggers who had challenged authority on the goldfields, who had buried their dead and elected their leaders and built something resembling democracy in the mud, were not the kind of men who would wait forever for an answer. The grievance had been building long before anyone thought to build a barricade. Every miner on the Victorian goldfields was required to purchase a license, 30 shillings a month, payable whether he found gold or not. The license proved nothing, protected nothing, and guaranteed nothing. What it did was generate revenue for a colonial government that had no interest in disguising its contempt for the men digging its earth. Police conducted license checks called digger hunts, moving through the camps in packs, demanding papers, arresting those who could not produce them on the spot, chaining men to logs in the open sun while their claims sat idle. The injustice was not subtle. It was the point. By the spring of 1854, Ballarat was a city of roughly 20,000 people, and it was furious. The murder of James Scobie in October provided the spark. Scobie, a Scottish miner, was beaten to death outside the Eureka Hotel, owned by a man named James Bentley. The evidence against Bentley was clear enough. The magistrate who cleared him happened to be Bentley's business partner. When the diggers heard the verdict, they burned the hotel to the ground. The colonial government's response was to arrest the miners responsible, not the killer they had been trying to hold to account. What followed was the rapid, furious organization of men who had run out of patience. A Ballarat Reform League formed, drafting demands that amounted to a democratic program, an end to the license system, representation in the legislature, and the right to vote. When the colonial governor dismissed their petition without reading it, the diggers made their answer plain. On the 1st of December, 1854, beneath a sky blazing with stars, several hundred miners gathered at Bakery Hill and swore an oath. Their leader was an Irish-born engineer named Peter Lalor, 30 years old, steady in voice and manner. The flag above them bore the Southern Cross on a blue and white field, sewn in a single night. The oath they swore was to stand together by their rights and liberties. Then they built their stockade from overturned carts and wooden slabs, and they waited. They did not wait long. At 3 in the morning on the 3rd of December, roughly 300 soldiers and troopers moved through the darkness toward the stockade. The miners inside numbered perhaps 150, many of them asleep. What followed lasted barely 20 minutes. The soldiers fired, the barricade fell, and when the smoke cleared, 22 miners and 6 soldiers were dead. Peter Lalor lay wounded in the dirt, his left arm so badly damaged it would later be amputated. The colonial government, convinced it had crushed a rebellion, put 13 miners on trial for high treason. It had miscalculated badly. Melbourne juries acquitted every single one of them, and the public mood turned decisively. Within months, the hated license system was abolished and replaced with a miner's right that also carried voting privileges. Within 2 years, Victoria had introduced the secret ballot and dramatically expanded the franchise. The stockade itself had been a military failure, a dawn raid on sleeping men inside a wooden fence. But the idea it represented proved impossible to suppress. The men who swore that oath under the Southern Cross had demanded that colonial authority answer to the people it governed. Gradually, reluctantly, it began to do so. The reforms won at Ballarat would flow outward through the colonies. Democratic pressure, once released, does not easily return to its container. And in the years ahead, the question of who truly governed Australia and in whose interest would only grow more insistent. By the 1860s, 6 distinct worlds occupied a single continent. New South Wales carried itself with the quiet confidence of the oldest colony, a place that remembered the convict ships and considered that history a kind of seniority. Victoria, flush with gold money, had grown into something brasher and more ambitious, its capital Melbourne one of the great cities of the British Empire. Queensland stretched north into tropical heat, its economy built on sugar and pastoral stations, its politics shaped by distance. South Australia had been founded without convicts, a fact its citizens never quite stopped mentioning. Western Australia remained remote almost beyond imagining, a tiny European settlement clinging to the continent's far edge. And Tasmania, the island to the south, watched the mainland with the wary attention of a smaller sibling. These colonies shared a continent, a crown, and a general language. They did not share much else. Their railways ran on different gauges, so that a train crossing from New South Wales into Victoria had to stop at the border while passengers changed carriages. They taxed each other's goods like rival nations. They competed for immigrants, for investment, for prestige. The idea that they might one day become a single country was easy enough to state and extraordinarily difficult to achieve. The moment that shifted the debate arrived on the 24th of October, 1889, in the small town of Tenterfield in northern New South Wales. Henry Parkes, 5 times Premier of the colony, 74 years old and possessed of magnificent white hair and a politician's gift for the memorable phrase, rose to speak after dinner in the local School of Arts. He called for the colonies to unite under a federal government. The empire needed it, he argued. The defense of the continent demanded it. The speech itself was not remarkable for its complexity, but for the fact that Parkes said it plainly, publicly, and at the right moment. The Tenterfield oration, as it came to be known, started a clock. What followed was a decade of slow, fractious negotiation. Constitutional conventions gathered in the early 1890s, drawing together delegates from across the colonies to argue over the shape of a new nation. The debates were serious and sometimes brilliant. Samuel Griffith of Queensland drafted much of the constitutional language with a lawyer's precision. Alfred Deakin of Victoria spoke with an idealist's conviction that federation was not merely practical but necessary for a coherent Australian identity. Edmund Barton of New South Wales argued with a steadiness that would eventually carry him to the prime ministership. But federation was not inevitable. Queensland worried about southern domination. Western Australia, experiencing its own gold rush through the 1890s, had little obvious reason to tie itself to eastern colonies struggling through a severe economic depression. Smaller colonies feared being swallowed by larger ones. Draft constitutions went to referenda in 1898 and fell short of the required numbers in New South Wales. The compromises required were genuine and painful. The Senate would give equal representation to each state regardless of population, protecting the smaller colonies. The constitutional text was revised, renegotiated, and put to the people again. In 1899 and 1900, the referenda passed. Colony by colony, including eventually Western Australia, the voters agreed. The British Parliament enacted the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act in July of 1900 to take effect on the first day of the new century. 6 colonies had become one nation. What that nation would choose to be, the laws it would write and the exclusions it would enforce, was now the question waiting to be answered. The morning of the 1st of January, 1901 broke clear and hot over Sydney. 100,000 people pressed into Centennial Park, wearing their best clothes in the summer heat, standing beneath eucalyptus trees to witness something that had never happened before. A new nation was being born, and they had come to see it. The ceremony was imperial in its ambition. Lord Hopetoun, the first Governor-General, was sworn in beneath a vast pavilion. Edmund Barton, steady and dependable as ever, became Australia's first Prime Minister. Cheers rolled across the park. Church bells rang across the city. The 6 colonies, after decades of argument, had finally become one Commonwealth. But what kind of Commonwealth? The new Parliament wasted almost no time in answering that question. Within months of taking its seat in Melbourne, the federal government passed the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. The mechanism at its center was a small, elegant cruelty known as the dictation test. Any immigrant could be required to write out 50 words dictated to them in any European language selected by an officer. The language chosen did not need to be English. A Japanese businessman fluent in English could be handed a passage in Welsh or Portuguese. Failure meant exclusion. The test was never meant to assess literacy. It was meant to exclude, and it excluded with surgical precision. Between 1902 and 1909, over 1,000 people were tested. Only 6 passed. The same year brought the Pacific Island Laborers Act, directed at the Kanakas, the workers from Melanesia and the Pacific Islands who had been recruited, sometimes forcibly, to cut sugar cane in Queensland for decades. The new nation had decided they did not belong in it. By the end of 1906, more than 7,000 Pacific Islanders had been deported, loaded onto ships, and sent back to islands many of them had never known as home or had left as children. Some had Australian-born children. Some had lived in Queensland for 20 years. None of that was considered sufficient reason to stay. The logic underlying both acts was the same. Australia would be a white nation. The phrase was used without apology by politicians across the spectrum, including men otherwise considered progressive. Alfred Deakin, the idealist who had argued so passionately for federation, supported the White Australia policy with equal passion. He saw no contradiction. In this, he was entirely representative of the political consensus of his time. What the new Constitution said about Aboriginal Australians was, in a way, even more revealing than what it said about immigration. It said almost nothing. Section 51 gave the federal parliament power to make laws regarding people of any race, but explicitly excluded Aboriginal people from being counted in the census. Section 127 reinforced the exclusion. The people who had lived on the continent for 60,000 years were not to be considered part of the nation being built upon it. They were not citizens. They were not counted. They were, in the constitutional imagination of 1901, simply not there. The new parliament did not spend all its energy on exclusion. It also began constructing something remarkable, the foundations of a modern social state. Old age pensions were established. Tariffs protected Australian industry and kept wages high for the workers inside the system. The Harvester Judgment of 1907 would soon establish the concept of a basic wage, a living income that any working man deserved. Australia was building a welfare state early by the standards of the world. The irony was deliberate and barely hidden. The protections were for white Australians. The generosity assumed the exclusions. A nation had been inaugurated in a park on a summer morning, and its character had been established within a single parliamentary session. It was prosperous, ambitious, and deeply bounded by race. The question of who truly belonged would echo through the coming decades, growing louder with each war, each wave of migration, each generation that grew up on soil its founders had never intended for them. The legislation was unremarkable in its language. State and territory governments, from the 1890s onward, passed acts with measured, bureaucratic titles. Protection Acts. Aboriginal Welfare Acts. The words sounded like care. They were instruments of erasure. Under these laws, officials known as protectors were granted sweeping authority over Aboriginal lives. They could control where Aboriginal people lived and worked, who they could marry, and how they spent their wages. Most significantly, they could remove children. not with the consent of families, not with any meaningful legal challenge available. Simply remove them on the judgment of an officer who decided a child's circumstances were unsuitable. The threshold was deliberately vague. Vague was useful. Tens of thousands of children were taken over the following 8 decades. Estimates vary, but historians believe between 1 in 10 and 1 in 3 Aboriginal children were removed from their families during this period. They were placed in church missions, in government institutions, and in the homes of white families where they worked as domestic servants and farmhands, sometimes without pay, sometimes without any contact with their parents for years. Some never saw their families again. What was the ideology driving this? Architects were candid enough in their own documents. The Chief Protector of Aboriginals in Western Australia, A.O. Neville, put it plainly in 1937. He believed that through the removal of children and the control of marriage, Aboriginal people of mixed descent could be absorbed into the white population within 3 generations. He called it, with unblinking confidence, the opportunity to merge Aboriginal people into the broader community. The Aboriginality in this vision would simply disappear. It was not presented as destruction. It was presented as salvation. Children taken young enough were forbidden from speaking their languages. They were given new names. They were taught to be ashamed of where they came from. Girls were trained for domestic service. Boys were trained for farm labor. The education provided was minimal by design, enough to make them useful, not enough to make them independent. Letters sent between children and parents were sometimes intercepted. Visits were discouraged or denied. The separation was not incidental to the policy. It was the policy. Life in the missions and institutions ranged from regimented to brutal. Some children experienced physical and sexual abuse that would not be properly documented until the inquiries of the 1990s. All experienced the particular violence of severance, of waking each morning in a place that told them, through every rule and ritual, that who they were was something to be overcome. What does it do to a person to grow up believing their identity is a problem to be solved? The trauma did not end when the children grew up and left. It moved through families. Parents who had been removed became adults who had never been parented. Languages that were not passed on became languages that died. The connection to country, to ceremony, to the intricate web of kinship that structures Aboriginal life was severed in ways that could not simply be repaired by the passage of time. The last formal removal policies were not wound back until the 1960s and 70s, though individual removals continued beyond that. For most of the 20th century, this was not a secret program. It was policy. It was funded. It was defended in parliaments. In 1997, a national inquiry finally gave this history its name: the Stolen Generations. The report, bringing them home, documented testimony from hundreds of survivors and recommended a formal apology. That apology would take another 11 years to arrive, delivered from the floor of Parliament on the 13th of February, 2008. The reckoning with what had been done was coming, but it had taken most of a century to begin. While the policies of removal were being written into law at home, a distant war was about to write something else into the Australian soul entirely. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, Australia did not pause to deliberate. Prime Minister Andrew Fisher, campaigning at the time, made the commitment before Parliament had even been consulted. Australia would stand by Britain to the last man and the last shilling. The sentiment was genuine. The Dominion, barely 13 years old as a federation, still understood itself largely through the lens of empire. To defend Britain was, in many Australian minds, to defend themselves. Nearly 420,000 Australians would eventually enlist. They were volunteers, every one of them. No conscription bill ever passed. Young men from farms and cities, from the outback and the coastal towns, signed up with a particular swagger. They were the products of a young country, and they knew it. The question was what that country actually was. The answer, for better and worse, was about to be hammered out on a peninsula in the Ottoman Empire. The 25th of April, 1915. Before dawn, small boats moved through dark water toward the western coast of Gallipoli. The men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, had been told the landing would face limited resistance. What they found instead were steep, tangled cliffs and Turkish defenders under the command of a 33-year-old colonel named Mustafa Kemal, who understood exactly what the high ground meant. The Australians scrambled ashore and climbed. Turkish rifles opened from above. By the end of that first day, over 2,000 Anzacs were dead or wounded. What followed was not a swift campaign. It was 8 months of suffocating stalemate. Narrow trenches cut into chalk and scrub, the dead lying in no man's land in the summer heat. Dysentery moving through the ranks as steadily as bullets. The promised breakout never came. Each assault gained meters at the cost of hundreds of lives. The commanders were far away, the planning was catastrophic, and the men in the trenches knew it. By December, the decision was made to evacuate. The withdrawal was, by bitter irony, the best executed operation of the entire campaign. Almost no men were lost leaving. 6,800 Australians had died on the peninsula. Many thousands more were wounded or sick. But something unexpected had happened in that failure. The letters home, the dispatches of journalist Charles Bean, the accounts that filtered back to Australian newspapers described not defeat but character, resourcefulness, dark humor, mateship under fire, a refusal to be broken. Australians began to read about themselves in a new way. The Western Front would demand far more. At Fromelles in July 1916, over 5,000 Australians were killed or wounded in a single night. At Pozieres, taken and held under relentless bombardment through the northern summer, Australian divisions suffered casualties that exceeded the entire Gallipoli campaign. At Passchendaele in 1917, men advanced through mud that swallowed the wounded whole. The scale of loss was staggering for a country of fewer than 5 million people. 60,000 Australians died in the war. Nearly 150,000 more were wounded. Yet it was Gallipoli, not the Western Front, that became the founding myth. The landing at dawn, the impossible cliffs, the young men facing their first great test as a nation. Every April 25th, Australia stops. The Anzac legend is not simply about a battle. It is about the story a country chose to tell about itself, and the question of whether that story left enough room for the other stories too. That question would take decades to fully surface. The men who came home from Gallipoli and the Western Front returned to a country that had promised them everything: land, stability, a reward for survival. What many received instead was a lesson in how quickly promises dissolve under economic pressure. The soldier settlement schemes of the early 1920s placed returned servicemen on farming blocks across Australia, often on land that was marginal at best, worthless at worst. Governments had been generous with their intentions and careless with their surveys. Soldiers who had endured posiers now found themselves fighting thin soil, falling wool prices, and mounting debt. By the late 1920s, the scheme was widely regarded as a quiet catastrophe. Thousands of families walked off their blocks. The land that was supposed to be the reward for sacrifice became another kind of wound. The 1920s brought a surface prosperity to Australia's cities that papered over these failures. Manufacturing expanded, suburbs spread outward from Sydney and Melbourne, and consumer goods began to appear in households that had never known them before. Yet beneath this, industrial tensions were sharpening. Workers pushed for better conditions. Employers pushed back. The relationship between Australian labor and Australian capital had never been comfortable, and the decade's boom made both sides bolder. Then 1929 arrived, and the floor gave way. The Great Depression struck Australia with particular ferocity. By 1932, unemployment had reached nearly 30% of the workforce. In some industrial suburbs, the figure was higher. Men queued for hours outside labor exchanges. Families moved into Hessian shelters along riverbanks. Children went to school without shoes. The suffering was not abstract. It had addresses and names and faces. Into this crisis stepped Jack Lang, the Labour Premier of New South Wales, a large and combative man who believed the banks and Britain's bondholders should bear the pain rather than ordinary Australians. His refusal to meet interest payments to British creditors put him on a collision course with the federal government and ultimately with the Crown itself. In May 1932, the Governor of New South Wales, Sir Philip Game, dismissed Lang from office. It was a constitutional earthquake. Whatever one thought of Lang's policies, the sight of a British-appointed governor removing an elected premier shook the foundations of democratic assumption. The imperial relationship, for many Australians, had shown an uncomfortable face. That same year, Britain had passed the Statute of Westminster in 1931, formally granting dominions like Australia full legislative independence. Australia did not adopt it until 1942, and then only because a world war forced the issue. The reluctance was telling. The ties to Britain were not merely legal. They were emotional, financial, habitual. Even as the Depression exposed how little protection those ties actually offered ordinary Australians, the political class was not ready to let them go. The crisis had asked hard questions. The answers, it turned out, would require another war to fully emerge. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, Australia followed within hours. There was no debate in Parliament, no pause for reflection. Prime Minister Robert Menzies made the announcement on radio, and his words carried the old assumption intact. When Britain was at war, Australia was at war. The emotional arithmetic had not changed. Australian soldiers shipped out to North Africa and Greece, fighting under British command across landscapes as foreign to them as the moon. They performed with distinction in the deserts of Libya and the rocky passes of Crete, and they paid for that distinction in blood. Yet something was shifting beneath the surface of imperial loyalty. The men fighting in North Africa were far from home, committed to a European war, while the Pacific remained largely unguarded. Then came December 1941, and the world cracked open. Japan's simultaneous strikes on Pearl Harbor, Malaya, and Hong Kong in a single December week made the danger suddenly, viscerally real. Australia's Prime Minister, John Curtin, responded with words that broke decisively from decades of deference. In a newspaper article published on the 27th of December 1941, he declared that Australia looked to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links with the United Kingdom. It was a sentence that would echo through the following century. Curtin was not abandoning Britain out of resentment. He was doing something more pragmatic, and in its pragmatism more radical. He was acknowledging that geography mattered more than sentiment. The fall of Singapore on the 15th of February, 1942 confirmed every fear. Considered an impregnable fortress, the island surrendered to Japanese forces after barely a week of intense fighting. 15,000 Australian soldiers, the bulk of the 8th Division, marched into captivity. It was the single largest surrender of Australian forces in history. The men who survived would endure years of brutal imprisonment, building railways in the jungle, dying by the thousands from disease and violence and starvation. For Australia, the psychological shock was profound. Britain had promised that Singapore would hold. It had not held. The Great Imperial Guarantee, the reason Australia had sent its sons to distant wars for 40 years, had proven to be something closer to a comfortable illusion. The danger was no longer theoretical. On the 19th of February 1942, Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin in the largest foreign attack ever carried out on Australian soil. More than 200 planes struck the harbor and the town. Shipping was destroyed, buildings leveled, and nearly 250 people killed. Further raids followed along the northern coast. The continent itself was under threat. Australia's salvation would come not from London, but from Washington. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Melbourne in March, establishing his Pacific Command on Australian soil, and American forces began flowing into the country in vast numbers. The alliance Curtin had called for was becoming real. That alliance would be tested along a jungle ridgeline in New Guinea. The Kokoda Track Campaign, fought through the Owen Stanley Range in the second half of 1942, became the defining military experience of the Pacific War for Australians. Young soldiers, many of them barely trained, held and then pushed back Japanese forces through terrain of staggering difficulty. Mud, disease, exhaustion, and ferocious combat became the daily reality. They did not fight for king and empire. They fought for the country directly behind them. By the time the campaign on Kokoda was secured, the nature of Australia's place in the world had been fundamentally redrawn. The old relationship with Britain had not vanished, but it had been tested to its limits and found wanting. A new one, forged in the Pacific, was taking its place. The war had revealed something uncomfortable about Australia's place in the world. The continent was vast, its population thin, its northern reaches barely settled. When Japanese bombers appeared over Darwin, the vulnerability was not merely military. It was existential. And the man who would attempt to answer that vulnerability had a slogan simple enough to fit on a bumper sticker. Arthur Calwell, Australia's first Minister for Immigration, put it plainly: populate or perish. The arithmetic behind the phrase was stark. Australia held a continent of nearly 3 million square miles and fewer than 8 million people. If it could not fill that space, someone else eventually would. The solution was migration on a scale the country had never attempted. Beginning in 1945 and accelerating through the following decade, Australia launched one of the most ambitious immigration programs in the world. The immediate source was not the British Isles, but the shattered cities of post-war Europe. Displaced persons, refugees, survivors of a continent that had torn itself apart, were offered passage in exchange for 2 years of directed labor. They arrived by the shipload at ports in Melbourne, Sydney, and Fremantle, blinking in the southern hemisphere sun, carrying everything they owned in single suitcases. The migrant hostel was their introduction to the New World. These were former military facilities, rows of corrugated iron huts in outer suburbs, functional and cheerless. Families from Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Yugoslavia were housed alongside one another, separated from local communities by language, custom, and often deliberate policy. Australians called them New Australians, a term that acknowledged arrival while deferring belonging. Then came the Italians, the Greeks, the Maltese. By the 1950s, Southern European communities were remaking Australian cities from the inside out. Melbourne's Carlton and Sydney's Leichhardt filled with espresso machines and delicatessens with languages that had never been heard on those streets before. The children of migrants grew up between two worlds, speaking one language at home and another at school, carrying the weight of their parents' displacement into an entirely new future. The most spectacular expression of this new national energy was the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. Begun in 1949 and employing over 100,000 workers across its life. The project bored through granite ranges and redirected rivers to power a growing nation. More than 70 nationalities worked on it. Men who had been enemies a few years earlier dug tunnels side by side. It became a foundation myth of multicultural labor, a story Australians would tell themselves for generations. And yet a line remained. The White Australia policy, operating through selective application of the immigration criteria, ensured that for all the nationalities now represented in Australian cities, the borders were drawn at skin color. European diversity was welcome. Asian migration was not. That contradiction would not hold forever. But in the 1950s, it remained the unexamined assumption at the heart of everything, waiting for someone to name it. While Australia told itself stories about migrants remaking the nation, and other people waited. They had always been there, of course. But in the official version of the national story, they were largely absent, classified not as citizens but as a problem to be managed, absorbed, or forgotten. They refused to be forgotten. On the 26th of January 1938, while white Australia celebrated the 150th anniversary of European settlement with processions and speeches, a gathering of Aboriginal men and women met in Sydney's Australian Hall. They called it the Day of Mourning. The date that others marked with fireworks, they named with grief. William Cooper, Jack Patton, Pearl Gibbs, and dozens of others demanded full citizenship rights, equal wages, and an end to policies that stripped Aboriginal people of their children and their land. The hall was filled, the speeches were direct, and the government did nothing. But something had been said out loud that could not be unsaid. 8 years later, in the scorching heat of Western Australia's Pilbara region, Aboriginal pastoral workers walked off the stations where they had labored for generations in conditions little removed from servitude. They received no wages or almost none. They could not leave without permission. In 1946, under the leadership of Dooley Bin Bin and supported by a white activist named Don McLeod, around 800 workers went on strike. The walkout lasted years. The authorities tried to break it. They largely failed. The Pilbara strike would never become as famous as it deserved to be, but it demonstrated something the authorities had not quite expected: organized, sustained collective resistance. Then came a different kind of protest, one that arrived in Parliament not as a march but as a document. In 1963, the Yolngu people of Yirrkala in the Northern Territory learned that their land was to be excised for a bauxite mine without consultation or consent. Their response was the bark petitions, formal documents written in both Yolngu and English, mounted on sheets of bark art and sent directly to federal parliament. They were the first formal documents from an Aboriginal community to be recognized by Parliament, and they asked a simple question: by what right had this been done? Parliament received them, then it approved the mining anyway. But the petitions had established something important about the legitimacy of Aboriginal political voice. In 1965, a young man named Charles Perkins boarded a bus in Sydney. Inspired by the Freedom Riders of the American South, Perkins and a group of university students traveled through rural New South Wales, exposing the segregation that kept Aboriginal people out of swimming pools, barbershops, and public spaces. Cameras followed. The footage shocked urban Australians who had preferred not to look. Moray and Walgett were not distant problems. They were an hour's drive from cities that considered themselves modern and fair. By 1967, the momentum was undeniable. A referendum asked Australians whether the Constitution should be amended to allow the federal government to make laws for Aboriginal people and to count them in the census. More than 90% voted yes. It remains the highest affirmative vote in Australian referendum history. And yet, the right to be counted was not the same as being heard. The right to government legislation was not the same as justice. The land was still gone. The children taken in earlier decades were still gone. The referendum was a beginning, not an arrival. What came next would test whether that yes vote meant anything at all. The world Britain had built was changing faster than Australia had anticipated. In January 1973, the United Kingdom formally joined the European Economic Community. It was, in practical terms, a polite economic betrayal. For decades, Australian farmers had shipped wool and wheat and butter across 12,000 miles of ocean to British tables. Preferential trade arrangements had made this relationship the backbone of Australian prosperity. Now those arrangements were gone, replaced by European tariffs and European partnerships. The old mother country had found a new family, and Australia was not in it. The timing was not lost on Australians. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam had swept into office in December 1972, and his government arrived with an agenda that seemed to ask, with some urgency, what Australia actually was. One of the answers it gave was decisive. In 1973, Whitlam's government completed the dismantling of the White Australia policy, abolishing the last of the racial criteria that had governed immigration since Federation. Multiculturalism was not merely permitted now. It was, slowly, becoming the official framework. The idea that migrants should be absorbed into an Anglo-Australian identity gave way to something more honest about what the country already was. The transformation was visible in the streets of Melbourne and Sydney, in the restaurants and the languages and the faces of suburbs that had been remade by post-war migration. Australia had been plural for decades. Now the law and the rhetoric began to catch up with the reality. The cultural reckoning continued into the following decade. In April 1984, Australia formally adopted Advance Australia Fair as the national anthem, replacing God Save the Queen at official occasions. It was a small change on paper. In practice, it was a statement about whose story the nation intended to tell. A song that named the continent, rather than a distant monarch, would open the football matches and the school mornings and the Olympic ceremonies. Then came the legal finality. The Australia Act of March 1986 severed the last formal threads connecting Australian law to the British Parliament at Westminster. No longer could Britain legislate for Australia in any capacity. No longer could Australian courts appeal beyond the High Court to the Privy Council in London. The legal architecture of colonial relationship, built over nearly 2 centuries, was quietly and deliberately demolished. What was left? The crown remained, technically, in the form of a shared monarch. The flag still carried the Union Jack in its corner. But the relationship had become something harder to name, something between history and habit, between sentiment and inertia. Britain had become, as one diplomat observed at the time, a foreign country with familiar furniture. The question now was not whether Australia would define itself apart from Britain. That process was well underway. The question was what it would choose to put in the space that empire had left behind. The space that empire left behind was not empty. It had always been occupied by the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, by 60,000 years of law and language, and belonging that the colonial project had spent 2 centuries refusing to see. In 1992, the High Court of Australia was finally forced to look. Eddie Mabo was a Torres Strait Islander man from Murray Island, who had spent a decade arguing before the courts that his people had never surrendered their land. The legal doctrine of terra nullius, the fiction that Australia had been legally empty at the moment of British arrival, had underwritten every land grant, every pastoral lease, every mining claim since 1788. On June 3, 1992, the High Court struck it down. 6 judges to 1, they recognized that Indigenous Australians had possessed and occupied this land before colonization, and that, in some circumstances, that title survived. It was, in constitutional terms, an earthquake. The entire architecture of colonial land ownership had rested on a lie, and the court had said so plainly. Mabo himself did not live to hear the verdict. He had died of cancer 5 months earlier. The following year, the Keating government translated the ruling into legislation. The Native Title Act of 1993 created a framework for Indigenous land claims, and the reaction from pastoralists and mining companies was immediate and ferocious. Warnings of economic catastrophe, of backyards and farms being seized filled the newspapers. The fear was largely manufactured. The practical reach of native title proved narrow, constrained by decades of prior land grants. But the symbolic acknowledgement that prior ownership existed at all had changed something permanent in Australian law. What the law still could not address was what had been done to people. In 1997, the Bringing Them Home report documented in devastating detail the policy of removing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, a practice that had continued in various forms from the late 19th century until the 1970s. Tens of thousands of children had been taken. Families had been shattered across generations. The report recommended a formal government apology. For 11 years, that apology did not come. On February the 13th, 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd rose in the House of Representatives and said sorry. Sorry to the stolen generations, to their families, to the communities broken by deliberate government policy. The galleries were filled. People wept in the streets outside on giant screens. It was a moment of genuine national weight, long overdue, and, for many survivors, both profound and insufficient. Words, however honestly spoken, could not return a childhood or a mother. The question of what recognition actually required grew more urgent across the following decade. Calls for a treaty, for constitutional recognition, for structural Indigenous representation gathered momentum. In October 2023, Australians voted in a referendum on whether to establish a voice to Parliament, an Indigenous advisory body enshrined in the Constitution. The result was a decisive no. 60% of voters and every state rejected the proposal. The reasons were many and contested. Distrust of the detail, confusion about the process, deliberate misinformation, and an older resistance that some observers recognized from arguments that had greeted Mabo and Rudd alike. 235 years after Arthur Phillip raised his flag at Sydney Cove, the reckoning between Britain's colonial project and the people it had displaced remained, unmistakably unfinished. What had been built in that time, the nation, the institutions, the mixed and complicated society, would carry that incompleteness forward into whatever came next. On the 6th of November, 1999, Australians were asked a simple question with a complicated answer. Should Australia become a republic? The result was 55% against. The monarchy survived. Yet to read that outcome as a ringing endorsement of the crown would be to misunderstand almost everything about what happened. The referendum had fractured not between monarchists and Republicans, but between Republicans themselves. The model on offer was a so-called minimalist republic, where Parliament would appoint a president rather than voters electing one directly. Many Australians who wanted a republic voted no anyway, unwilling to trade an inherited monarch for a politician's appointment. The Prime Minister of the day, John Howard, a committed monarchist, had quietly ensured the question was framed in the way least likely to pass. The Republican cause never recovered its momentum. The question drifted. Years passed. Decades. Then, on the 8th of September, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle at the age of 96 after 70 years on the throne. She was the only monarch most living Australians had ever known. Her face had been on the coin since before their parents were born. Whatever complicated feelings Australians held about the institution, Many held genuine affection for the person. The grief was real, and so was something else. The quiet recognition that the arrangement had just become harder to explain. King Charles III ascended automatically. No election, no national conversation, no Australian voice in the matter whatsoever. A man most Australians had spent decades regarding with mild skepticism was now their head of state by simple inheritance. Polling told the emerging story clearly. Among Australians over 65, support for the monarchy remained substantial. Among those under 35, it had collapsed. Each generation arriving at political consciousness found the connection more distant, the rationale thinner. The shared post-war cultural ties that once made Britain feel like a kind of extended home had dissolved across 50 years of immigration from Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Australia's face had changed. Its constitution had not. The tension at the heart of Australian national identity, acknowledged but unresolved for a century, remained. A country that had largely ceased to think of itself as British still carried a British monarch on its currency, swore its judges and new citizens to the crown, and conducted its highest legal appeals through inherited constitutional architecture. What would change it? A charismatic Republican leader willing to spend political capital. A generation simply running out of patience. Perhaps another royal transition, arriving before the question had time to go back to sleep. The history of Britain and Australia had never reached a clean conclusion. It had simply continued, layered beneath a society that was unmistakably its own, waiting for the moment when the last threads would be examined, and Australians would decide, once and finally. 2.5 centuries after Arthur Phillip planted a flag in the clay of Sydney Cove, Australia is a nation that has outgrown its origins without yet fully reckoning with them. The economic arithmetic tells one part of the story clearly. China is Australia's largest trading partner by a margin that would have been unimaginable to any post-war prime minister who once anchored the country's prosperity to British markets. Japan, South Korea, India, and the nations of Southeast Asia collectively define Australia's commercial future in ways that make the old imperial trade relationship look like a footnote. The pivot is not ideological. It is gravitational. Australia sits where it sits, and the weight of the world has shifted toward it. Migration has redrawn the country just as decisively. Today, nearly 1 in 3 Australians was born overseas, and the largest source countries include India, China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. The Britain that once supplied the overwhelming majority of Australia's newcomers now ranks far down a longer, more diverse list. Walk through Western Sydney or Inner Melbourne, and the transformation is not abstract. It is visible, audible, delicious, and entirely irreversible. And yet the architecture of British inheritance endures. The Westminster system still governs. The common law still shapes every contract, every trial, every civil dispute across the continent. The English language, for all its Australian mutations, remains the tongue in which the nation argues with itself. These are not relics. They are load-bearing walls, and Australians of every background now inhabit the structure they hold up. What remains most painfully unresolved sits deeper than any constitutional debate. The dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, begun in 1788 and never fully halted, continues to produce consequences that are measurable in life expectancy, incarceration rates, and the distance between promise and reality in community after community. The colonial project did not end. It transformed into policy, bureaucracy, and neglect, and its effects move through generations like something carried in the blood. The question of what Australia owes its first peoples is not merely moral. It is the question that sits beneath every other question about national identity. Who tells the story of this continent? Whose history is taught and whose is omitted? The debates are ongoing, often uncomfortable, and nowhere near settled. What does it mean to hold a British past in the Pacific present? Perhaps this. It means carrying a legal system robust enough to challenge power, a language elastic enough to hold new voices, and institutions capable, when pushed, of transformation. It also means carrying a wound that has never been properly treated, and a reckoning that 236 years of history have not yet produced. Australia did not emerge from Britain cleanly. It grew from it, argued with it, drifted from it, and kept more of it than many Australians care to admit. That inheritance in all its complexity is still being sorted, still being disputed, and still being written. Australia's story, born from chains and flags and 60,000 years of silenced voices, is still unfolding. Subscribe for more histories that refuse to look away.